Hello and welcome to Finding Genius. My name is Kyle O'Brien. If you haven't been here before, I'm also an operating partner at Revia, a VC fund based here in Paris. And I also read a newsletter on the French tech ecosystem called Startup ROI. Today, I want to welcome to the video series Josh Dzielak, the CTO and co-founder of Orbit, which is an online community platform based here in Paris, but I think we'll get into kind of his team structure a little bit later in the call. Josh, welcome to Finding Genius.
Thanks for having me, Kyle. Really happy to be here.
Yeah, likewise. Well, I wanted to start off kind of because we have similar backgrounds. I think we're two Midwesterners living in Paris, and that's somewhat atypical, maybe less so in post-pandemic times, but wanted to talk about your origin story, where you're from in the US, and how did you get into the tech sector?
Yeah, sure. So let's see, I grew up outside of Chicago, Northern Illinois, and kind of fell in love with computing at a pretty early age with an Apple II that I bought at a garage sale and some other hardware that was laying around. I don't know if it was really programming, but it was making spreadsheets and just generally getting to know software. And then I went to the University of Illinois for computer science, and that was really interesting. Only about 3 hours south of where I grew up, but still kind of a whole new world. A lot of stuff happening. I was very focused on studies. I was not very privy to the startup ecosystem and everything happening back then. I
Okay.
think it was kind of the days of PayPal and like Max Levchin moving to Silicon Valley and things like that. I was mostly oblivious. I was just trying to finish my degree and then eventually get a job and worked in big
Right.
companies for a while and then hopped over to startups. And that's kind of got me on the path that, ultimately led to creating Orbit and all that. And happy to dig in wherever.
Yeah. So I guess in that era when you were graduating from college, you mentioned you were zeroed in on your studies, but there must have been some kind of distant attraction to Silicon Valley culture or this emerging Silicon Valley culture. What was your process after school applying to gigs and trying to move out west?
Yeah, there was a bit in school where toward the end of me being there, this startup called Facebook started to come kind of on the scene, and I actually
I've heard of it.
actually
Yeah.
remember just as a little side project making a web application where like some of the people that I lived with could upload their photo and write a little status message. And at the time, I was like, "Oh, this is really cool." And then I didn't do anything like that for 5 years. I joined Accenture right out of college because there was the
Okay.
promise of travel. Um, and I wanted to travel. I wanted to get out of the Midwest a little bit and bounce around. And so I joined Accenture out of college, doing a lot of Java. It was actually very technical. This was still back when you could be like a consultant at one of the big firms, but still be very technical, be a technical architect, work with that. I think that's still possible, but I think it's a little bit less common these days. But
Mm.
it was really good because I did get to learn a lot about enterprise technology, financial services, banks, and eventually it brought me to Phoenix and then the Bay Area. So that's how I ultimately got to the Bay Area. It was not like, hey, I want to go do startups. This is awesome. I want to go put it all on the line. It was much more of I was at Accenture. I was looking for a client in California because California just sounded cool and I'd never been there. And one of my buddies was staffed at an insurance company in Northern California and was able to pull some strings and get me onboarded to that project. And then I was in the Bay Area for 12 years. So I kind of stuck once I got there.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, can you tell me about a couple of the companies you joined in the Bay Area at that time? I know a couple of them. One in particular, Algolia, which is a well-known French tech company, but I suppose they had a presence out in California at the time. And what it was like joining a kind of a fast-paced, high-growth startup in that era.
Yeah, it was a great experience. The one job before that, I worked at and kind of was on the founding team for a startup called Keen, which was
Okay.
my first foray into developer tools, developer communities, building APIs. This was the time when kind of Twilio was blowing up and Stripe was starting to
Mm.
really hit their stride. Um, and so so post Keen, I really wanted to be not just an engineer, but starting to like do more of the developer advocacy work that I'd been doing. For when I was at Keen, I was the VP of engineering, but we were very community focused. And so a lot of my work was also focused on building the community, on understanding like what people were trying to use the technology for, going to meetups, working with the developer advocates there. So when I hopped from Keen to Algolia, it was really the first time that I had done any kind of community role, advocacy role, something like that. And I had met Nicola and Julian, the founders of Algolia, when I was at Keen, right before or maybe right after they had gone through Y Combinator. So we had met some number of years before I actually reached back out to them and said, "Hey, I'm looking for my next thing. Are you hiring any developer advocates yet?" The company was around 35 people at the time. And sure enough, that's actually a role that they were looking for. And I joined in the San Francisco office. There was a San Francisco office at that time. I think it was maybe 10 or 15 people. You're right. The majority of the team was in Paris. But I got to spend about half of my time in Paris. Actually, being a developer advocate, you have to work with so many different people in the company. And so I was working a lot with marketing and sales in San Francisco. And then I was working with more design, engineering, product while I was over here in Paris.
Right.
But no one can keep that much travel for very long and that much arrangement. And just before I joined Algolia, I met my future wife on a trip to Thailand. And she's French. And so the combination of that plus Algolia is ultimately why I permanently came to France and have been here ever since. So, but it was kind of
part love, part work, which sounds like a pretty typical experience here.
Yes, yeah, it very much it very much was. So yeah, things. It's like the dominoes fall or something like that. It wasn't just one thing. It was that I just looked like the best path at the time, and I'm really glad that I did. It's been fantastic being here.
Yeah. Well, I was in a role where I was responsible for a team in Paris and New York, and that's only a 6-hour difference. So I can imagine that travel back and forth between San Francisco and Paris can be fairly grueling. But there is one kind of challenge, problem, discussion topic that I find pretty fascinating that comes up pretty often today, which is cultural differences between Silicon Valley and X. And in our case, it's typically Paris. And what is the Paris French tech ecosystem like? But in the world where, the flat world we're living in, the post-pandemic world, distributed world we're living in, you've probably read, Balaji's long treatise on the Silicon Valley's ultimate exit. Now, everywhere is going to become kind of a mini prototype of Silicon Valley. I'd like to zoom in maybe a little bit on the Paris ecosystem, and maybe we can start with your experience being a developer advocate in San Francisco for a French tech company that was building its roots out west. I think that must have been a pretty interesting place to be, especially in a nascent kind of French tech environment, at least in those days.
Yeah, it was interesting because community and developer relations, developer advocacy, that was really just starting to be more defined. It still wasn't very defined. So when I went to Algolia, I had kind of an interesting double challenge of working in a non-US based culture for the first time. And then also developer relations, establishing the first type of that role at the company, and where the whole industry of developer relations was still figuring out, like, what do we call this? What do we call that? What do we do here? Should we live in marketing? Should we live in product? Should we live anywhere else in the company? So there's a lot of definition. And I certainly learned my share of cultural lessons, fitting in, things like that. Differences in terms of feedback, how it's given, how it's received. And boy, I mean, just a lot of different things there. I think particularly one of the things with community and DevRel is that it requires kind of a long-term commitment. You don't always know what's working along the way. This is kind of the classic problem, and this is one thing we try to help people solve at Orbit. So depending on like how much a culture, it depends on immediate results and showing value at like each step of the way versus like winging it for a little bit longer. I think Silicon Valley companies at that time were probably less quantitative in some regards. So one of the things that I had to essentially get better at when I joined Algolia was reporting metrics around community. So I had a lot of
Mm.
examples from Silicon Valley where it really wasn't being done yet, and it was a little bit more like, let's take it on faith. And that sometimes that worked. It didn't always work, and so it was in some ways a trial by fire. But I just learned a ton by trying to figure out how to do that. How can community present the same level of metrics as like marketing, sales, product, things like that. So it's a very, very inspirational experience.
Yeah, and there's been quite a bit of work in the community spaces that's formalized as a role or a title at most companies that I would imagine a decade ago, just there was just no vocabulary. There's no way to articulate it necessarily. So you were kind of feeling your way through the dark and coming up with the metrics that made the most sense at the time, but have become somewhat industry standards at this point.
Yeah, yeah, we were really trying to figure it out as we were going, and it's not. Oh yeah, one thing you can observe that is different between now and then is when companies are looking for their first community hire, their first developer advocate hire, um, as a sense for like the kind of the belief in the value of that kind of growth, or kind of that having that kind of person.
Right.
At Algolia, like I mentioned, I joined around 35, 40 people, but the whole engineering team, and really the whole company had been doing a version of advocacy and a version of community at that point. They've been doing open source libraries, they've been doing meetups, talks, hosting events at their space in Paris. So I didn't come on and do the first advocacy. That was actually already happening. My job was to kind of build that into a program and accelerate it and give it even more leverage. But now I think a company that's making a developer tool or building a community first, their community and DevRel hires are in the first 10 people, sometimes the first five, sometimes one of the founders. 40 would be, I think, a crazy number for a community-led company, developer-facing company, whoever it is, to hire their first community people. But back then, that was like, okay, it's about the right time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit more about community. I mean, this is something that's been on my mind lately. It's actually in my new title at the VC that I'm working at. I lead content and community efforts, so I'm now formally, some sort of community advocate, or at least on my LinkedIn profile, I am.
That's great.
And my previous experience, I've worked on community products. So at Salesforce, they had their community cloud, which was more of a B2B kind of service oriented community that bolted onto your CRM. I worked at a startup here in Paris that is more of a kind of alumni networking community, privatized LinkedIn. I worked at another startup that was actually implementing a community strategy. So we leveraged an existing tool and started to onboard customers into the community and built, groups and conversation topics and in-person events. So I've seen kind of all sides of the many-sided die
Yeah.
that is community and community management. Your expertise falls neatly within the developer category. Maybe I'm making an assumption there, but can you talk about what developer advocacy and community building is like? Like, what are the fundamentals for those who haven't really experienced it firsthand or aren't developers themselves but work in tech and kind of hear rumblings but haven't been to an event?
Yeah, I can I can try to do that. Maybe look at some first principles.
Yeah.
Like one in community is you're connecting people to each other, and you're building a network of people, and that network has a mission. Like, it's not just a network, but it also has a mission, a place that it's trying to go. And that can be the big difference with things that other people have done, where it's more about my relationship with this person. Community is about these people's relationship with each other, or this person's relationship to other members. So you end up, a lot of the job is making introductions and trying to figure out who can add value for the other people in the community. So in an open source community, very common thing that is needed is to find more contributors, find more maintainers, support users, and it comes down to like the roles that people play in the community and helping grow those people into roles. So a lot of like very good community advocacy, developer advocacy that I observe is connecting members to each other who can help them grow into the roles that they need to play for the overall community to be able to scale. We say at Orbit, we have this concept of gravity, which is like a kind of the attractive force that keeps people coming to the community, that keeps it valuable. And that gravity is based on the connections in the network, and also the deepness of the involvement that members have. And you can grow a community if it has enough gravity. You can't grow a community if there's not a lot of gravity, because just like you pour a bunch of people onto the top of the community, and you've certainly seen this before, playing such a variety of community roles. Like you can't always just grow the community, but that's what a lot of people want these days. They're like, oh, let's grow the community. And if you're a first-time developer advocate or community advocate, you might really be given that mission of growth. But if you only pursue growth, you're actually going to shoot yourself in the foot. You'll create a space that no one actually wants to be at, and you won't see members deepen their involvement. So we say you have to create growth and gravity at the same time. So you're making the community bigger, but you're also making it more able to provide the same experiences to new members as like the early members. So you're kind of like keeping the value, keeping the core of the community together. That's one of the hardest things to wrap someone's head around, is you have to, you can't just have new people come all the time. You have to find stuff for them to do, and it has to be the right stuff, and it has to be with other people that they meet. And that alchemy is not usually something that someone has practiced in in a role like that before. And it's a very weird kind of thing, and it's like a je ne sais quoi almost that community builders have or develop over time.
Yeah, I mean, that reminds me of a framework that we held near and dear at one of my previous startups, which was an adoption, engagement, retention framework for getting people involved in the community. You have to facilitate them getting to adopt the tool, whatever that tool may be, whether that is actually a community tool or the product or service you provide, engaging them throughout the process. So day one has to be equally as engaging as day 5 and year 1, whatever you say.
That's it.
And then figuring out how to retain them and keep them on the platform long into their customer lifecycle or membership lifecycle, whatever that may be. And that, like you said, that is an alchemy that's not well defined. I mean, I think it's a little different in every community, and it depends on who your audience is. So in my experience, there's been a lot of audience segmentation, persona mapping, identifying champions and leaders within the community to help delegate some of the responsibility to. They can take ownership as well and represent the brand as an ambassador. Is that something you see kind of happen organically in the developer communities, because there is a very specific shared purpose around building a product together, like in an open source situation? How does that differ from other types of communities that you've been a part of?
Yeah, great question. I do think developer communities have a bit of an advantage in terms of the self-organization because everyone knows what the mission is. It's to build this software. They don't know exactly what software to build, where it should go. There's always like a group at the core who are, governing, stewarding, trying to figure out the direction of the project. Tooling like, GitHub and other things that exist, that makes that easy. And it also just makes it easy for people to contribute. So like the core atoms of contribution in developer community, and the purpose of it helps people do the right thing. That took a while to build, but now 10 years later, 15 years later, after a lot of the tooling, and open source itself is many decades old, like people just, developers are able to figure out what to do. Not every community has that same historical kind of or cultural or tribal embedded knowledge about what people should do. So I think some of the things that you said around like giving people roles, finding champions, understanding like the layers of the community, and for every how many champions do I need? If I have 1,000 people, then maybe I need 100 champions. If I have 20,000 community members or 2 million community members, I might need a different number. And so, there's one framework we use for thinking of different kinds of communities is product, practice, and play. Call it like the 3 Ps. And product community is around like a SaaS product or open source. A practice community is a community of practice. That could be people who are all helping each other get better at art or poetry or writing or their job or something like that. And then play is fun and passion. And I think each of those has a different uh, a different set of rules, and there's a different kind of ratio of participation. Like how many people are there to watch and more passively consume or passively participate versus there to actually volunteer, actively contribute, actively own. So the ratios are also very different between like a club, a stadium, a federation, these different like what we call topologies of communities. And the rule is for me, and when I talk to community builders, is figure out what topology you are and then build a community that way. But if you don't know if you're a club or a stadium or a federation with lots of pockets of gravity, then it's hard to have a community strategy. So you have to know what shape you want to become.
Can you tell me more about Orbit and the platform that you've built over the years, how people are using it, maybe some different instances of customer stories that could highlight how exactly it functions and what kind of features, functionality there is to offer?
Sure. Yeah, I'm happy to talk about that. We're very space oriented and space themed over here at Orbit, as you might imagine. So we think of it as mission control. We think of it
Okay.
as kind of an airplane cockpit that you can sit in and have signals sent to you, like what are people in the community doing, where what platforms are they contributing on, when are they reaching certain thresholds or certain milestones of their engagement that might represent like opportunities for you to reach out. So what we try to do is from this kind of massive stream of data that a community creates, pick out the most important signals, and then try to get those in our users' hands, so that even a small community team is able to kind of manage these kind of very big, sometimes multi-million member communities that you can't just like be two people and or even 10 people and do that.
Right.
So some of the features are around that kind of detecting interesting milestones and then providing integrations to tools like Slack, Zapier. So wherever the community team is living or the organization that community team is part of, we try to like build tooling to push that activity back there. Also to push it to other like company data sources if the company wants to analyze, let's say their community data alongside other data in their warehouse, or if they want things like community participation available in Salesforce, then they can do those things and put that together. And then let's see what else. We invest a lot in reporting. We think it's very important that community teams are able to prove the value of their work and show the ROI of community. So we have a big and very customizable reports module. Let's see. And for the developers, we have an API where they can actually send any kind of activity to Orbit, not just from one of their standard community platforms, but let's say they have an internal education or something like that. They can send that data in, and then they can use that to determine, where, like, what does an engagement path look like for a member? When should I offer them the right thing? Like, when's the right time? And so that's really what we're trying to do, is help people build the gravity of their community, and that's just a lot about surfacing the right information that leads to an action that a community builder wants to take, and that is something satisfactory and happy and fulfilling for the member.
Can you tell me where it sits within the kind of massive enterprise tech stack? So I can see in a developer use case like this layering on to like GitHub, for example, in an open source project, you can, I don't know, maybe track information that's taking place. But in the example that you mentioned where you're integrating with a Salesforce or a Slack, maybe you have a R&D developer team or something like that, or you have partnerships or some sort of ecosystem. Apple, for example, has a massive, or Microsoft has a massive developer ecosystem. They would want to use this and plug it into their tools to get visibility across the enterprise while also keeping their third parties engaged. So what's a typical use case look like, and how do you go about like setting that up and empowering the would-be admins in this community?
Yeah, I think one thing we spend time on with the bigger communities that come and find us. We like to be very hands-on and spend time with them. So we figure out kind of like who in the organization needs access to what community data, and like who shouldn't have access to certain kinds of data. We're very concerned about privacy and things like that. We want to make sure that like if an organization like you said, there's so many teams in an organization that are going to interact with the community, partnerships, biz dev, sales, marketing, everyone like that. So we try to personalize or customize the experience based on that. It's not something we do a ton of yet. So it's not like you log into Orbit and you're like, I'm part of this team at Microsoft, and like magically everything just transforms and shows you that. Something we want to do for in the future, because we're seeing that just in our data, we're seeing that more users than even we expected from each organization are joining Orbit to see like what's going on with the community. How can I interact with it? It's not just the community team. So for us on our roadmap, we want to make make sure that we can support people in those different cases and then allow them to collaborate. But inside the organization, it depends. Like often each department or each team has their own set of tools. Like there's kind of the blessed company stack, and Salesforce is in there and all the big stuff is in there. But then each team might have totally different tools. And that's why we try to both have an API and then also invest in like low code, no code integration. So we have a Zapier app, things like that, anybody on the team who knows how to do that can then plug that data into their workflow. But it's a really interesting part of the challenge to solve, because there's just so many different ways to use the data and people coming from different functions with different ideas on how to do it. So it's
Right.
that's been gratifying and also quite a prioritization challenge.
Great. Yeah. Well, I'd be remiss if I didn't ask about Web3 and kind of this obsession around community-led growth. It might not be your area of focus, but it's probably something that occupies some portion of your day-to-day thought, and you see it on Twitter and online. You're probably getting feedback from customers. Paris Blockchain Week was here not too long ago. I don't know if you had a chance to swing by. There's a lot of activity going on in the region and in broader Europe. So I wanted to get your take on Web3, how we can apply some of the community-based thinking that's been around for decades now, that's being layered onto the blockchain crypto principles, how that might work, why it is working in certain cases. I mean, there's a number of community-led NFT projects that have become extremely successful. So I wanted to get your take overall, and then maybe we can drill into a couple areas that you find interesting.
Sure. Yeah, I'll say, I'm definitely not an expert, but I do have a Twitter feed, and I see lots of stuff come through there, and it is really cool to see just how much community like activity there is. I mean, there's no doubt with DAOs and Web3, there's such a strong community story, like people coming together, like I said before, like a network of people with a mission. I mean, so many of these projects are exactly that. What changes is obviously the incentivization. So like, tokens and airdrops and things like that are different than some kinds of intrinsic community value or kind of project-based value, like developer community. We use this project together, but there's no walls between any of those things. A lot of Web3 projects are about like, let's create a piece of software together that does this. A lot of them are, so I think that a lot of all of the community paradigms are going to be created or reused or changed, by a lot of this activity that's coming in. When I have a minute to kind of keep an eye on it, some of my favorite things are to like look at the incentive structures and see how can non-Web3 communities benefit from that like high incentivization that Web3 communities have, like sometimes like gamification or some incentivization. One thing I think like non-crypto, non-Web3 communities don't think about enough is that layer. In community engagement. I mean, we don't want to go and gamify everything, but rewards, recognition, incentivizing, those are often like healthy things in a community if they're put in there in the right way.
Yeah.
And then I think the Web3, there's a lot of like historical community building knowledge and wisdom that they can tap into. Like, what do you do about moderation? What do you do about people who are not doing what you want? What do you do about things like that? There are communities who are 20, 30 years old, and there are forum platforms, other platforms, tools that have been working with that for a long time. And I don't know how much those two worlds are talking to each other, but there's probably a lot of opportunity there for like the kind of old
Yeah.
community and the new community to share a lot of the knowledge in both directions.
Yeah. Something I was speaking to another guest, Mike, the CEO of 3DM, a few weeks back, and he works in 3D e-commerce, and he sees a huge opportunity to be the bridge between 3D e-commerce and Web3. So, it used to be that you would want to take a shoe, for example, and render it in 3D so that someone that's shopping on your site is more incentivized to check it out, perhaps, increases their intent to purchase. Pretty obvious use case in hindsight. But now the question is, how does that impact supply chain? So, for example, maybe I go into an AR environment and I look or try on clothes, and then I don't actually have to, we don't have to have a huge a warehouse or a bunch of, additional stock of those clothes. We can make them on a custom basis and send them to someone. Or in the opposite direction, maybe someone has clothes that they wear in their everyday life and they want to go wear them in the metaverse. So maybe there's a kind of physical to digital transition. So the way he articulated was a Web 2.5 company. They want to build a pipeline from Web 2 to Web 3. And I saw some parallels between kind of what you're doing in the community space for developers. Do you see Orbit or maybe not Orbit specifically, but do you see an opportunity for a bridge between the two? I mean, kind of what, based on your previous answer, I'm assuming there's a yes there. I'm not sure how technical we can get on that topic though.
Yeah, I do think there's a yes. I think that there's like an online offline counterpart, and then there's also the Web 2 Web 3 counterpart where these things are going to be more intermeshed than we see them today.
Right.
I think a lot, what we could look to see is some historically Web 2 or older communities start to adopt like some things coming from Web 3. I think that's something that can happen. I've already seen it a little bit, like rewards or swag or giving away NFTs or something like that. Even if the whole community isn't a Web3 community, they might still be adopting some of those. So that feels a little bit like kind of Web 2.5. And it's also interesting to see SaaS tools try to accommodate Web3 too, and then try to figure out how that's going to work. We have a lot of Web3 users today because we have a Discord integration, and the Discord is obviously very popular in Web3, and so we're working with a lot of our customers and our users today to kind of figure out like what. From just like a community management and Discord perspective, is there anything different that you would need compared to a non-Web3 community? How do you set roles? How do you assign things? So we have those conversations, trying to, it's the ultimate challenge to figure out kind of what to do and when. But that's where I see, I see some of that bridging is going to take place through platforms that need to figure out how to accommodate everybody.
Yeah. Well, let's take a step back from the fully digital realm, the metaverse, so-called metaverse, and talk about building physical community in the context of founding a company abroad. So I think I can speak firsthand of what it's like to move here and to join a startup here, to try to kind of fight your way into the ecosystem. And it's probably different in every city and every country. We're probably fit to discuss our experience in Paris and in France. But what was it like starting a company abroad? And I don't remember when exactly you started. Was it pre-2017, I'm assuming, or in that time frame?
Yeah, Orbit was 2019, and the predecessor to it, which was a small kind of consulting thing that my co-founder and I created and worked together on, that was like 2018 maybe.
Okay.
And it's still an interesting journey. It's not an easy ride to start a company in a foreign country, start a company in France. Kind of deal with like one thing we didn't have to deal with was creating a company here and then having to reincorporate it to take funding. That was nice. Like when we did our pre-seed round, that was just a very standard, like, let's become a Delaware corporation, US based, just be on the normal track there. But as we've scaled up and wanted to hire globally, we've like done all of the things, tried all the solutions, anything from the SaaS companies that help you pay people in different countries to we now have our own SAS in France because we're really dedicated to growing here. So we've and once you reach 10 people, there are certain requirements and things like that. So what we did is look at a few countries that we're very confident in have a lot of future orbiters in them, and then try to make sure in those countries we can provide an employment experience that feels seamless, transparent. We can give TK Resto in France. We can do things like that.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes, and especially in Europe, that's what people want. They don't want to be an independent contractor because it's a pain in the butt, and then they have to do a lot of stuff on their own. And so we currently have people in maybe 11 different countries, but and we try to provide an employment experience that's as consistent as we can across those countries. But it depends. The reality is we can't control everything in that equation.
In the beginning, were you purely based here in Paris, recruiting developers from schools around France, or did you start out in a relatively decentralized manner?
Yeah, from the beginning, I was here in Paris, and my co-founder Patrick is in San Francisco. So we've always been 9 hours apart or 8 hours apart for 4 weeks a year because of the time zone thing, a crazy thing. Always gets us, throws the whole company off 4 weeks a year. Our first employee was hired here in Paris, and he was an engineer that I knew from the Jamstack Paris meetup. So actually, someone that I knew he was the organizer of that meetup, and that's how I knew him. And then we hired a few people in the U.S., and then we've hired a few more people here. So it was actually pretty even in terms of the early team, adding people in more on the Europe side, adding people on the U.S. side, and we also have 6 people in Africa that work for us. So we're like kind of very much time zone, from -9 or -7 all the way to +2, +3. That's where we operate, but we don't go beyond that.
And how does that impact workflow? I mean, are you working mostly asynchronously? And I would imagine that applying some of your community management skill set internally as well as externally with customers comes in handy.
Yeah, I mean that it's always the challenge. We have about 2 hours a day where we can do synchronous meetings across SF and Paris. Thankfully, we have a pretty good team in the East Coast, the Midwest. So there's a little bit of gradation there, but async by default for pretty much everything. We try to focus synchronous meeting time on problem solving, on demos, basically on things that just really lose their luster or hard to do async. But things like status, we try to really do a lot of that synchronously. We write a lot. Written communication is a huge part of the culture. And to your point, we do think, try to think of the company as a community. It very much is a community of its own. And so we think about like the different roles that people play and how we can pass information along the network in a way that everybody gets it and everybody can understand. So it's, I'd say it's definitely a work in progress. I love the fact that we're distributed, and I feel like we get an amazing amount of work done from doing that. But figuring out how to best use synchronous time and how to do the calendar Tetris that involves, that's something we haven't totally cracked yet. That's still pretty challenging.
Well, it sounds like you're doing a pretty fair job. There's a lot of people that are new to this, and many people that actually didn't really want that to necessarily be the default, but are adjusting to new norms in a post-pandemic era, employment standards.
Yeah.
So it's good that you have a little background and some experience, and I'm sure plenty of wisdom to share, lessons learned. I'm curious how, you just mentioned that incorporating in Paris and then incorporating in the US was relatively simple. There's a decent number of companies now that are helping you employ and make sure you're compliant across different countries, regions. what is it like raising venture capital in this environment? Has the distributed team element given you an edge because you kind of know how to do it, or you feel that you've built a good rhythm and workflow? Has that given you access to different forms of capital or different investors in different regions because of your kind of multi-localization? Can you just talk about like what was the kind of the how did you initiate the fundraising process? What has it been like, and what were some of your pros and cons as a result of your org structure?
Yeah, I would say, being distributed means that we get, to talk with more, potential investors when we're going out and doing, if we want to do something, like synchronously. So like kind of building the relationships, that's always a part of that process. That's, my co-founder lives in San Francisco, so he's very much like ground zero, able to meet with, and build relationships with the investors in the Valley. And our pre-seed was in 2019, so we did have, that was actually a pretty typical, like, let's go back and forth on the Caltrain to Menlo Park 3 times a week and see if we can raise a round. That wasn't very distributed at all, to be frank. I flew to San Francisco, and we just, took the train down to Sand Hill Road a couple times, but when we started to get a little more momentum, I was able to start building some relationships with VCs and investors over here in Europe. And Algolia had investors from the U.S. and Europe, and when I was there, I was able to kind of see, how some of those relationships worked, I guess, and like how the founders were very aware of that and building relationships kind of across everywhere. So I think that it took some inspiration. Now that everything is, very Zoom oriented and connected, I think that the in-person probably matters a little bit less, in terms of the relationship building, but we are looking to grow in Europe. Local experience is still, I think, very, very important. And especially for companies with a lot of US roots and maybe don't have a founder who is from one of the big markets they operate. Like, I live here in France, but I'm not from here. There's a lot that I don't know. And so I think as we get bigger, it's something we keep our eye on, like in terms of hiring, employment, legal, things like that, what we're going to run into as we grow, operating in different countries. That's where I think investors can provide a lot of value when they have local knowledge there.
Yeah. So you're, speaking of knowledge and investor relationships, it's been a fairly, well, I don't know if it's atypical, but there's been a flood of cash, let's put it that way, in the past couple of years. So a lot of momentum, hype, energy around traditional VCs, new angel syndicates. It feels like everyone's an investor these days. Now I'm actually in that world to a degree, and so I'm starting to get fairly familiar with how it operates, but I'm also fascinated by the different types of money. I mean, historically you heard about smart money and dumb money, but now you've got fast money or slow money. You've got people with specific domain expertise. You have a couple of very renowned, impressive investors on your cap table, Andreessen Horowitz and Cotu. So curious what kind of value they bring to you. What was kind of the differentiator in the discussions, and then moving forward as you expand. I think you kind of answered in the previous question. What would you be looking for as you expand within Europe or let's say Asia, for example? Does that change the calculus for you as to who you might want to join the round?
It's a good question. I know that for us, people are definitely kind of the most important part of the equation, and also the knowledge of what we're doing and the conviction, the willingness to get behind it. A couple of years ago, the community space had not taken off in the way that it has in the last couple of years. And for us, like very early on, it was really clear who got what we were doing and who didn't. And the people that we had the best relationship with were and who were able to see that and have those kind of conversations with us about where are we going in the future. Exploring big questions together, like, can this be a big thing? Can this not be a big thing? What kind of team will we need? And just in general, like, is there a belief that business is changing to be more community driven, and that's going to create all kinds of interesting opportunities? The people that we could have that conversation with are the ones we loved and ultimately ended up working with. The people who were not able to get there quickly enough, well, that didn't work out. So I think there's the people side, and then there's just like, there's no substitute for really feeling like someone has a passion for the space, is willing to learn, is willing to think through it together, is willing to anticipate challenges. So that part is just really, for me, like people and experience oriented, and that can come from anywhere. It could come from all over the world. But I think as a company scales, then the calculus changes a little bit. Then it could be more about, like, we're trying to scale in this market. Maybe we need someone on the cap table who really knows this market, or who knows this type of company, or who knows enterprise, or who knows Web3, or something like that. So that calculus in the beginning around someone who's really willing to get behind the idea and have a lot of passion for it, that changes a little bit. I think we're still, we're kind of in between those worlds. We're still a startup. We're not a full scale up yet. So I think, it's still really important to my co-founder and I that we have people on the team who really believe in the mission, who are really excited to bring this thing into the world, and to ultimately, like, make community such an integral part of the fabric of building a company, and that things, building everything. So let's see. I hope I answered the question in some meaningful way.
I think that's a good answer.
It changes with time, but I think that as we, as a company grows and they see, like, oh, we need this pocket of knowledge, or this information, or someone who can help us understand this corner of the world, that's where great partnerships can be formed.
Yeah. Well, I think that's some sage advice for any first-time founders looking to raise funds. I think that's a good place to close. I do want to offer up a quick opportunity to end here, being a CTO and a leader in the tech space in France, and also a community builder. If there's any amazing kind of communities that you joined that helped you early on, being an expat in Europe, or perhaps later on in your time here, that have been super helpful, any of those that you would advocate folks join if they're looking for some others to mingle with?
Oh, good question.
I know it's on the spot. So
no, I love it. The names of some of them will escape me. I did a language learning community that I really liked, and it's the very traditional one where it's kind of a lot of, like, students, and just once a week you do a conversation partner thing. Sure. Maybe the name will come to me, or we can put it in the show notes. But I thought,
if you forget them, you can send them to me after, and I can add with the show notes.
I thought that one was good. And let's see. Otherwise, I think I benefited a lot from, like, some of the early programming, like the places like The Family, places like Station F. I've never played a big role in those communities, but was able to, like, go to events and build connections through those events with other people. So I mean, it's kind of like, it is definitely in the realm of community. So I can definitely say, like, people in programs through there have were a part of helping me make connections here, learn, meet entrepreneurs, meet investors, things like that. And if I think of any more, I will let you know. I would love to start one. It's the other thing. So I don't think there's I don't know. Maybe you'll be able to tell me. I think more tech expats, and I don't know.
Station F has a really good expat community, in a French Tech International community.
Oh, fantastic!
Where I've reaped a lot of the benefits there, and spent quite a bit of time networking and going to their programming.
Oh,
and as I mentioned to you offline, I'm trying to start a community of community and content and community builders, and I'm gonna start putting those events together shortly. So anybody watching that's in Paris or Greater Europe that wants to join, feel free to ping me, and I'll get you involved in the list. So
It's great to hear you're doing that. I think it's a
yeah,
big need, and there's more people in the community content space than ever. And
yeah,
IRL is coming back in a big way. At least we certainly hope and we
yeah,
think. So, yeah, it's great
yeah,
to hear you're doing that.
exactly. Yeah. Well, Josh, thanks a lot for joining today, and it was a pleasure speaking with you. I'm sure we'll speak again. And other than that, let's be in touch. We'll add some of your things in the show notes in case some thoughts come to you. And have a great one.
Great. Thanks a lot. And thanks a lot for having me. Cheers.
All right. Take care.